I've been hiking alone for a long time. I started doing it in my early 20s because I liked the quiet, and over the years it just became my thing. Most people stick to the marked trails, but after enough trips, you start getting comfortable wandering off them. That's how you find the places nobody else really sees. Last October, I drove up to a remote stretch of forest for a weekend trip. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool, cloudy, and quiet. The kind of day where the woods feel still, like everything is just waiting. I'd been walking for about 3 hours when I ran into a ravine cutting across my path. It wasn't massive, but it was deep enough that you wouldn't want to fall, maybe 30 feet down to a rocky stream at the bottom. The walls were steep and crumbly, the kind of dirt and loose stone that would slide out from under you if you tried to climb down. Luckily, there was a fallen tree lying across it. It was thick, probably an old pine, and it was wedged between both sides like a bridge. The bark had worn smooth in a few places, which told me other people had probably crossed it before. I stood there for a minute checking it out. When you hike alone, you get into the habit of double-checking everything. I pushed against it with my foot. It didn't move, so I stepped onto it and started making my way across. I went slow, arms out a little for balance. The drop underneath looked a lot bigger once I was actually standing over it. Halfway across, I could hear the stream rushing below, and it made the whole thing feel higher than it really was. When I finally stepped onto the other side, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Then I heard a sound behind me. Thunk! A dull, chopping noise. I turned around and saw a man standing near the end of the tree on the other side of the ravine. He looked older, probably in his 50s. He had a messy gray beard and was wearing an old camo jacket with faded jeans. At first, I thought he was just another hiker. Then I noticed what he was holding. It was an axe, a full-sized one. Before I could even process that, he stepped closer to the base of the fallen tree and swung it. The blade buried itself into the wood with a loud crack. I just stood there staring for a second. Then he swung again. "Hey!" I yelled across the ravine. "What are you doing?" He didn't even look at me. He just kept chopping. Wood splintered off the trunk and fell down into the ravine. My stomach started sinking when I realized what he was doing. "Stop!" I shouted. "I just crossed that!" That finally got his attention. He looked up at me like he'd just remembered I was there. "That's not my problem," he said. And then he swung again. The trunk shifted slightly under the hit. Not enough to fall, but enough that I instantly knew I wasn't going back across it. I started yelling at him. I don't even remember exactly what I said, just a bunch of angry nonsense. The whole thing felt so insane. Who does something like that to a random person in the middle of the woods? Eventually, he stopped chopping. He leaned the axe against his leg and stepped closer to the edge of the ravine. I could see his face better then. His eyes looked tired and dark, like he hadn't slept in a while. He stared at me for a few seconds and then said something that stuck with me. There was no way I was risking it. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal. So I figured the only option was to follow the ravine and find another place to cross. At first, I wasn't too worried. Forests like that usually have narrower spots somewhere along the way. But after about 40 minutes of walking, the ravine only seemed to get worse. The drop got deeper, the walls steeper. Every time I thought I saw a possible crossing, it turned out to be impossible once I got closer. The sun was starting to drop behind the clouds, and the woods were getting darker. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Not just because I was lost, but because I couldn't stop thinking about that guy with the axe. After another stretch of walking, I came across a small clearing. It looked like someone had been camping there. There was a fire pit in the middle with blackened rocks around it, and the ground nearby was flattened like a tent had been there recently. At first, I was relieved. I thought maybe I'd run into whoever had camped there and they could point me toward a trail. But then I started noticing the trees around the clearing. They had deep carvings cut into them. Not initials, not arrows, just strange shapes and lines carved into the bark. Pieces of cloth were tied to some of the branches. Old rusty tools were lying around in the dirt. And near the fire pit were several small piles of animal bones arranged in circles. The whole place gave me a bad feeling immediately. I didn't stay there long. I turned and started heading back into the trees. That's when I heard something behind me. A crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I stopped walking. Everything went quiet. I looked back over my shoulder. Nothing, just trees. I kept moving, a little faster this time. A minute later, I heard it again. Footsteps, heavy ones. I spun around quickly and caught a glimpse of movement behind a tree, then another shape further to the left. That's when it hit me. There were at least 2 people back there, maybe more. They weren't even trying very hard to hide anymore. I could hear them moving through the brush. One of them had something metal in his hand that caught the fading light. That was all the motivation I needed. I took off running. Branches scraped my arms as I pushed through the woods. My backpack bounced against my shoulders with every step. Behind me, I could hear them running too. One of them let out a loud scream. Not words, just a long, raw scream that echoed through the trees. It made my blood run cold. I kept running until my legs felt like they were about to give out. Then I saw another fallen tree ahead of me crossing the ravine. It was thinner than the first one, but I didn't stop to think about it. I jumped onto it and rushed across. The trunk creaked under my weight, but didn't break. When I reached the other side, I turned around. 3 men were standing at the edge of the ravine. All of them looked just as rough and dirty as the first guy I'd seen earlier. One of them stepped forward and put a hand on the tree like he was thinking about crossing. Then he stepped back. They all stared at me for a moment. Finally, one of them said, "You got lucky." His voice was flat. Then he added, "Now go." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and kept running until I eventually found my way back to an actual trail. By the time I reached my car, it was already getting dark. I was hiking through a remote stretch of forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan a couple of years ago. It wasn't a popular area at all, which was exactly why I went there. I've never really liked crowded trails or parks where you're constantly running into other hikers. I prefer the deeper woods, the places where the trees grow thick and the ground isn't worn down by thousands of boots. That morning had started out perfectly normal. Cool air, gray skies, the smell of damp leaves everywhere. I'd been walking for a few hours, navigating mostly by the position of the sun and a rough mental map I'd built from studying the area beforehand. Eventually, I realized something wasn't right. Nothing around me looked familiar anymore. When you hike off-trail, that can happen sometimes, but usually you can backtrack or recognize a landmark. This time, every direction looked exactly the same. The trees were packed tightly together, tall and thin, and the ground floor was covered in thick moss that swallowed any footprints I might have left behind. I told myself not to panic. I'd been in similar situations before and always found my way out eventually. Still, that uneasy feeling started creeping in. I decided to just keep moving in one direction. Standing still wouldn't help anything. That's when I first heard the sound behind me. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling somewhere in the trees. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. I turned around slowly, scanning through the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. I figured it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon or something else passing through the brush, so I kept walking. About 30 seconds later, I heard it again, the exact same rustling sound. And again, when I stopped, it stopped. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. Animals in the woods usually avoid people. They don't match your pace like that. I picked up my speed a little, hoping whatever it was would lose interest. Instead, the sound came again, closer this time. I turned around quickly and thought I caught a glimpse of movement behind a tree, but whatever it was disappeared before I could really focus on it. For the next few minutes, it kept happening. Walk, rustle, stop, silence. Eventually, I started realizing something worse. The sound wasn't just coming from one direction anymore. It was coming from multiple sides. Before I could fully process that, the brush around me exploded with movement. Wolves. At least 6 of them stepped out from between the trees. They spread out in a loose circle around me, keeping their distance, but clearly blocking every direction I could run. Some of them were low to the ground, baring their teeth. Others just stared at me with those cold, steady eyes wolves have. I'd seen wolves before while hiking, but never this close and never like this. It didn't take long to understand what was happening. They weren't just curious, they were hunting. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking as I slowly reached for the knife on my belt. I knew a knife wouldn't do much against a pack like that, but it was the only thing I had. I tried to make myself look bigger, standing tall and holding the knife out in front of me. The wolves didn't move. They just watched. One of them took a slow step closer. For a moment, I was certain that was it, that this was where it ended. Alone in the middle of the woods because I'd decided marked trails were too boring. Then something strange happened. Every single wolf froze at the exact same time. Their ears shot straight up, and their heads all turned in the same direction behind me. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at something else, something deeper in the forest. A low whine came from one of them. Another wolf took a step backward, and then, without warning, the entire pack bolted. They didn't just retreat slowly either. They ran like they were terrified. Sprinting full speed through the trees in the opposite direction from wherever they'd been looking. Within seconds, they were gone. I was alone again. At first, I just stood there, trying to process what had happened. Then, I noticed something else. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind in the leaves, nothing. It felt like the entire forest had just stopped breathing. A chill ran down my spine. If a pack of wolves had been scared enough to run like that, then whatever they'd seen had to be worse than me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see something standing in the trees behind me, but there was nothing there. Just rows of dark trunks stretching into the distance. I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to, so I started walking again. About 20 minutes later, I came across a clearing. At first, I thought it might be an old campsite. There was a circle of stones in the center like a fire pit, but as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Symbols had been carved into the trees surrounding the clearing, deep cuts forming strange patterns that didn't look like anything I recognized. Several branches had objects hanging from them, small bones tied together with thin cords, rusted pieces of metal twisted into odd shapes. The fire pit itself looked strange too. The stones weren't just scattered around randomly. They were stacked carefully, almost like someone had built little towers out of them. And hovering right in the center of the clearing was something I still can't explain. A thick cloud of black smoke. It wasn't rising from the fire pit. It wasn't drifting through the air either. It was just hanging there, perfectly still, about 6 feet above the ground, like it had weight. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have. For some reason, I couldn't look away. It felt like the longer I looked at it, the harder it became to move, like my brain was trying to understand something it wasn't supposed to. A deep sense of dread started building in my chest, the kind that makes you feel like something terrible is about to happen, even if you don't know what. Finally, something in my head snapped me out of it. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running for a long time. My memory after that gets fuzzy. I remember crashing through the trees and tripping over roots. I remember the sky getting darker. The next clear memory I have is reaching the edge of the forest and seeing my car parked where I'd left it. It was already night by then. I got in and drove away without looking back. I never went back to that area. And the strangest part is that I can barely remember the route I took that day. The more I try to think about it, the more those memories seem to slip away, almost like something in those woods doesn't want to be remembered. A few years ago, when I was around 20, a couple of my friends and I decided to take a short camping trip during spring break. We'd been doing trips like that since high school. Nothing fancy, just throwing gear into the back of a truck, driving somewhere quiet, and spending a night or two in the woods. This time it was me, my friend Tyler, my girlfriend Jess, and Tyler's cousin Mark. Tyler had found a forest area in southern Missouri that looked pretty remote. There were a few hiking trails, some cliffs, and apparently a couple of caves people like to explore. It took us most of the day to get there. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was already getting dark, so we decided not to hike very far the first night. We walked maybe 10 minutes into the trees, found a small flat area, and set up our tents. The first night was completely normal. We made a small fire, heated up some canned food, and sat around talking for a while. Eventually, we got tired and turned in. The next morning, we packed everything up and started hiking deeper into the forest. The weather was perfect. Cool air, quiet woods, and barely anyone else around. Nobody really said anything, but it definitely made us uncomfortable. We finished eating and kept hiking. About an hour later, we found a small clearing near a shallow pond and decided that would be our campsite for the night. We set up the tents, gathered some wood, and started a fire as the sun began to set. For a while, things felt normal again. We cooked dinner, had a couple beers, and told dumb stories like we usually did on trips like that. Eventually, the fire burned down and everyone went to their tents. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. It sounded like something dragging slowly across the ground. Scrape, pause, scrape. I sat up and listened carefully. Then I heard whispering, very quiet voices somewhere outside the tent. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. When I shined the beam toward the trees at the edge of the clearing, I saw two people standing there. One of them was the tall man from earlier. The other person was shorter but just as thin, with long, messy hair hanging over their face. They weren't talking anymore. They were just standing there, staring directly at my tent. I yelled for Tyler and Mark to wake up. The second I shouted, both of the figures turned and ran into the forest. Within seconds, they were gone. Everyone came out of their tents and we stood around the fire trying to figure out what to do.